Dr. Sandeep Patel, who comes from significant experience in government, was trained as a PhD nanochemist, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know in much better detail in the last 10 months as we worked together on some public health communication challenges. But he is expert in some ways, is trained in the nanosphere, where so many of you work and excel and achieve and help, to being able to cast really micro nano observations to the largest observations, which is our health is dependent on the health of our community, our county, our state, our country, our world, and ultimately our planet. And so it's my privilege for our last speaker, Dr. Sandeep Patel.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Is this on? Okay. This is a great meeting, by the way. So thank you, Meredith, first of all, for helping me navigate this, and then Larry. I actually have not met the second Larry, so we will meet later. I'm just doing it left to right in order. And then thank you, Michelle and Wendy Sue, for even suggesting coming here. But so I spent the last 10 years in public service, actually the first 6 in the immediate office of the secretary at HHS, Health and Human Services, and then the last 4 building and leading an R&D funding unit within BARDA, which was the agency responsible for developing all the, with partnerships, all the medical countermeasures, vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics for the COVID response. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about kind of that experience, but what I wanted to do is sort of tie this into, kind of the lessons learned during the pandemic in terms of how, it can offer a blueprint for how we might think about a different way of sort of building a better public health, especially in this time when, we're in a highly fragile state. So I want to sort of start with this observation that, I think we can predict with pretty high likelihood that there's going to be another COVID-like event in the near future, but that the probability of any single scenario happening is going to be pretty low. And this is really important to and I'll come back to this. So first, just wanted to dispel this idea that pandemics are rare. They are in fact not rare. The number of zoonotic spillovers over the last several decades has actually increased exponentially. We once thought Ebola outbreaks were rare, but they are extremely common now and regular. We have novel pathogens emerging out of places like the Amazon. Last year, had Oropache that popped up, which is a novel pathogen that spilled into humans. And a bunch of different sort of groups have a kind of converged in this idea that you have a roughly 25% probability of a pandemic-like event over the next 10 years. So where would they come from? There's a list. These are a bunch of viral families that a lot of people sort of will hit as the highest likelihood, places you might see a pandemic. These you may know some of these, you may know all of these, but these are kind of a lot of the sources. And the typical way that folks like me and the groups that I used to work for in the biosecurity, biodefense kind of world, the typical way we would prepare for these kinds of things is sort of this 4-step process. So first, we would just sort of distinguish and prioritize threats. What's our list, right, of all the things we're worried about and scared about. Second, we would go through this sort of punch list of all right, well, we need to figure out all the things we need to develop to prepare for these things. And usually it's a vaccine, a treatment, and a diagnostic. And so we basically have this sort of punch list. The third is, all right, well, let's figure out how we're gonna develop these as much as we possibly can. Maybe get them ready, clinical trial ready, or if we can get them, approved, we can stockpile them and let's just punch through this list as fast as possible. Figure out a way to distribute them. And then the fourth thing is to basically let's write a playbook. Let's figure out in any scenario, how are we gonna get these to the people that we need to get in all these scenarios. The problem with this strategy though is that what happens when something shows up that's not in our playbook, right? That we didn't think about, that we didn't understand before. And that's gonna throw everyone sort of for a loop. And just to give you an example of what are some of these kind of high consequence, low probability things that are gonna, monkey wrenches are gonna throw everyone off. The first category is sort of AI-enabled biothreats. We live in an age now where it's getting extremely easy and more democratized to go in and design de novo proteins, organisms, to mix and match functions and to sort of effectively develop entirely new types of biothreats. Everything from taking a influenza spreading engine and putting it in something another more virulent kind of viral function, to redesigning prions to be biothreats. There's a whole variety of things in there. The second category is spillover, as I talked about. Again, this as we tear down forests in the Amazon, as we tear down the Congo Basin. This is becoming more and more likely to spill over new things. Cholera was mentioned earlier. Cholera showed up in the world because the British decided to tear down all the mangroves in Bangladesh, right? That's what unleashed that onto the world, right? The third category is what fungal pathogens. Now, anyone who's watched the animal videos where they show fungal pathogens hack the brains of insects to make them jump off, and kill themselves off of leaves, knows that they're a very scary and black box kind of part of the kingdom. And while most people would think right now, or most experts would generally agree that fungal pathogens aren't necessarily pandemic level kind of threats. As climate change kind of pushes the boundaries, we're going to see more and more fungal pathogens that we just didn't know about emerge. So anyway, there's a whole set of these things. And just to give you kind of an example of why our current approach to addressing these things is sort of off, I think it's helpful to go back to the sort of COVID timeline. So if you go back in time, first symptoms in Wuhan show up December 12th, 2019. 29 days later, first sequence was published. Very fast timeline, given historical trends. 50 days later, WHO declares emergency. 91 days later, we have the first commercial PCR test in the US. And 372 days later, about a year later, we have the first vaccines authorized in the US. Now, these are all record-breaking timelines. And it was actually quite amazing that it happened so fast. But all of this is reactive to COVID showing up, right? And I think that's fundamentally a problem, especially for things that are unknown. And the way the Defense Department would talk about this is we need, there we go. We need things, all of this stuff needs to be left of boom, right? That's the term that they would use. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about sort of how we might do that. Sorry. Okay, so this is a lot of what my team at BARDA. So the team that I ran at BARDA was called DRIVE, Division of Research Innovation Ventures. We were kind of an early high risk, high reward R&D group where we were investing in a bunch of different things to not only respond to COVID-19, but to prepare for future pandemics. And the way we approach things was to sort of do the opposite of what everyone else is thinking. The normal way of thinking about these threats is to say, what's different about each one, and how can we solve for that difference, right? And we sort of flipped that around and said, no, well, what's common about all of them, right? And what can we do to address the commonalities across any of those scenarios? And I would sort of call that the common factor strategy. And one way to illustrate this, I think, is to say, all right, on one plane, you can say, all right, we're going to list a whole bunch of threats, like I talked about earlier, and how do we solve for all those individually? And in that sort of worldview, you naturally come on these interventions of yeah, we need a vaccine, we need a treatment, we need some kind of test, and that makes a lot of sense. I think if you start thinking about all of these threats in kind of one unit, and think about this as a totality of future health security threats, you sort of get these emergent properties, right? And you can see the list here. You get all of these things that suddenly pop to the top of the list of oh, we need to solve for these things. Because no matter what the situation is, these are going to be problems, and these are going to be things that we need to address. So one example of this is that it's one of the common sort of consequences of an infection and injury in a lot of issues is that your immune system gets thrown out of whack, right? It becomes dysfunctional. And this is an issue with just about every viral and bacterial infection. And so severe infections, COVID and flu, people often died not of the pathogen, but because of sepsis or acute respiratory distress syndrome. And so thinking about like, well, if we had capabilities to understand in real time what someone's immune state was like, this is a really useful tool. This will be really useful in an emergency situation, and I don't really care what the situation is. Things like a sepsis drug would be incredibly useful in these scenarios. We have no sepsis drugs right now. Staff shortages, again, an issue no matter the threat. I'm going to know we're going to have to have clinical trial capabilities, surge clinical trial capabilities. We're going to need surveillance. Oh, and we're going to need funder coordination, right? This is not something that most people think about, but I can guarantee you when there's an emergency, all of a sudden there's going to be this ability or this need to get a whole bunch of different funders to coordinate around what all of the sort of needs are in investment, and we haven't really figured that out yet. Rapid manufacturing, indoor air quality, especially for respiratory infections. These are all really important things in that sort of layer. And so these are the kinds of problems that we sort of attacked on my team at BARDA. And these are these are 6 of like the many kind of R&D programs. Most of these were started during the pandemic, some of them prior. One of the programs was to develop clinically approved host-directed therapeutics. So again, these are therapeutics for indications like sepsis, for acute respiratory distress syndrome. We have drugs for neither of those indications today. We had a program on developing alternative delivery mechanisms for vaccines. And so, if you had the ability, for example, to take a patch and just self-administer a vaccine and get vaccinated in 30 seconds, that would be incredibly useful, especially in a situation where you had to, bring on a whole bunch of healthcare workers, to administer vaccines in that setting. We had a program to develop safe and effective ECMO. So if you remember, one of the few efficacious therapies for severe acute respiratory distress syndrome was to administer ECMO, which is an extremely invasive therapy. It's a device that usually exists within NICUs for children, and was suddenly being used for adults all over the country. And so and it was rate limiting because you needed both expert healthcare workers to administer, and it was extremely dangerous to administer it. And so we had a whole program to think about, well, what if we developed field deployable, portable, safe ECMO devices? That would be sort of transformative and useful. We had a program around developing next generation sequencing diagnostics. And so the idea would be like, all right, well, if we had an assay that could detect a pathogen, no matter what it was, it would be both useful as a surveillance tool, but also it would be a day one diagnostic, right? You wouldn't have to wait the 2 months that we did for a COVID diagnostic. Distributed vaccine manufacturing, lab at home, these are other programs that we had. I don't need to we actually talked a lot about these pathways earlier in different contexts, but just to point out that immune dysregulation is a very common consequence of infection, and it is surprisingly common across different types of severe infections. And so again, figuring out ways to both diagnose and intervene at this level is extremely, extremely useful. We had a lot of great successes during the pandemic. But one of the things that I'm sort of most proud of is we had 4 FDA approvals for our partners for kind of first-in-class sepsis diagnostics. One of these is a 10-minute blood test that's designed for the emergency department. There's other uses for these. But these are incredibly transformative because these have the ability to predict whether someone's going to be septic 24 hours to 72 hours in the future. And this would have addressed, if it was available during the pandemic, would have been an incredibly important triage tool in those crowded emergency rooms. Another sort of thing that we did as a sort of non-R&D kind of area within our team was to really think about this problem around, again, another emergent property, around this sort of panic neglect cycle of emergencies, right? We have this tendency that in peacetime between emergencies for biodefense, we just tend to not invest in anything. No one cares. And when there's an emergency, suddenly there's panic, right? And all of this money gets thrown into the system, and a lot of it gets misplaced, and it's not the most effective way to prepare. So we wanted to figure out, well, how do we hedge against this? Without having to completely change the way Congress appropriates dollars, is there something that we can do to kind of manage this? And so we thought, well, what if we create a public-private VC partnership where we could deploy money in a sustainable way, where we could invest in companies that had capabilities that both had commercial capabilities, but also things that are useful during pandemics, and sustain a whole set of those companies, and then use the returns from those investments to kind of recycle back into the system. So we dumped $250 million into this partnership. We asked our partner to match that with other investors, and sort of created this fund called the Global Health Security Fund. It's too early to say, but I'm incredibly excited about this mechanism, and hopefully it's a way for financing to kind of continue in this sort of peacetime situation. What I wanted to do there's a line here, I forgot. What I wanted to do too is during the pandemic, there was sort of this issue too of thinking about, well, our approach to addressing these sort of future emergencies was to think about the sort of, what's common across these, and can we build solutions that will prepare us, without having to think about or predict what's going to actually happen. And so the question arose, well, can we apply that strategy more broadly as kind of a blueprint for how we might think about a larger set of public health issues? And so I wanted to sort of run over kind of what that might look like with you all. But maybe it's first sort of helpful to establish the sort of the coupling that happens between pandemic emergency situations and broader public health kind of issues. And so first, there's a bunch of spillover effects that happened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the first time, we introduced programmable vaccines, which is just massively important, I think. We're still yet to really see what that might lead to, but it's incredibly exciting. For the first time, we introduced home pathogen testing. This is an area where both the regulators and actually the larger public health community was very resistant to introducing home testing for pathogens until the pandemic. And now we have this sort of it's sort of been unleashed, which is great. Decentralized clinical trials, existed for a long time. But the pandemic really made it both just a necessity to enable this. So everything from remote blood collection to remote recruitment. I think we've sort of transformed how clinical trials could happen as a result of the pandemic. But the opposite also happened. There was what I would call sort of negative externalities during the pandemic, which was, what I mean by that is that there was elements of the pandemic response that were limited by factors that were outside of our immediate control and the immediate control of those responding. And so 3 examples of this, or one is the breakdown of trust in science. This was a trend that was sort of long in process, but it was an extremely important barrier, both to getting vaccinations out, for people to understand what was happening with the pandemic. Trust arguably got worse during the pandemic for a number of different reasons, but this is a larger issue that's not just about any one issue. The second is sort of this fractured R&D investment infrastructure. So we have this situation where I'll mention this a little bit later, but we have a very fragile research and development funding system in this country right now, and it's being exposed over the last 2 months with all of the volatility that's coming out of the federal government in terms of its research budget. And this is a fundamental problem, especially when we need multiple funders to focus on something in an emergency situation. The third is what I would sort of call this bias to healthcare. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this idea that we've been trying to wedge a lot of public health things into healthcare. And while that's good in many ways, it also is bad in many ways, and I'll explain a couple examples of that. Just to go over this sort of diagram again. So when we think about larger public health issues, the sort of key question is, I started earlier with how do we prepare for future threats? If we want to start asking ourselves the question, how do we actually prevent them from happening? We have to move to a slightly higher plane here. And we have to think about sort of the population level health kind of level and layer. And here, again, you see a new set of interventions that kind of emerge out of this that didn't exist in those other 2 layers. I went over the sort of trust in health information. This is a key fundamental problem. Durability is a really big problem, right? Governments are great at turning on and off things when they need to be. but they are not good at ensuring that there are durable solutions in place, and this is fundamentally important. One example of this is during we were part of Operation Warp Speed in terms of the vaccine development, and the things that actually worked in that response were actually things that were already in place prior to the pandemic happening. Where we didn't succeed were things that we had to create de novo, and so the story was usually told that everything was kind of created as a response, but a lot of existing programs were kind of pulled into it, and so this is really important. Funding system I talked about, health data science literacy is fundamental, and again, we saw a lot of the weaknesses in the response. And I would argue that I think public health visibility is a big issue. Again, I'll sort of talk about this in a minute a little bit more. I want to sort of hit really quickly kind of a bunch of different actors in this space that have sort of participation and how I think they're kind of fundamentally misaligned with where we need to go with public health. Let's talk about venture capital for a moment. Venture capital is really important for developing a lot of sort of scalable technologies, in tech and biotech and lots of places like that in healthcare. But venture capital is great and likes to hit home runs. They do not play small ball. They do not like triples, singles, doubles. They don't know how to play them. They don't want to play them. And this is a problem because not every problem needs home run level approaches. And so we have a fundamental capital structure problem. Like we don't have the right type of money to really fundamentally improve public health. If you look at the sort of the public and global health communities, I'm obviously part of it for many, many years, but there's this mentality that sort of where I think there's this allergy to sort of for-profit partners, and so you see these like otherwise good partnerships that should have happened not happen. There's a limitation, I think, oftentimes of thinking about policy or service delivery kind of solutions, and I think this is a limitation. And all of this sort of creates this scenario in which it's very hard to attract entrepreneurial talent into this space, and I think that's sort of a fundamental problem. Pharma and healthcare, great. There's lots of great things about it. One of the weaknesses of the system is that there's very few sets of solutions that fit really well into that, and so you see a lot of issues that should exist on their own as like products or services for public health, but because we try to wedge them into healthcare, there's some limitations. And again, I'll go over a couple examples. I want to hit on sort of health information for a minute. I think this is something that Wendy Sue and I have been working on for a while now. But lots of sort of fundamental problems here. One is that the average U.S. adult spends about 70 minutes a year in direct contact with a healthcare professional. If this is the way that most Americans get health information, this is a problem, right? At the same time, you have most Americans that distrust either the healthcare system or governments. And again, this is a fundamental problem. But you see that most Americans, 61% Americans, are concerned about what they put, products they put in their body, but that they rarely or aren't able to kind of research what those are. And so I think this both speaks to some problems, but it speaks to some opportunities for delivering health information to people in new ways. A little bit more about the sort of funding ecosystem. I think a lot of people here have been involved in fundraising from federal government. Many of you may have been funders in the past, but this is an extremely high friction, low transparency, low throughput system that I think has worked really well. It was invented, basically around World War II, and we benefited greatly from this system. But it's starting to break in a lot of different ways. PI spend an inordinate amount of time fundraising. Funders are often operating in these silos where you write one proposal to one funder, they don't share anything with other funders, and so you're writing multiple proposals. Funders don't coordinate, so you see a lot of redundancy, you see a lot of issues around there. You see both governments and philanthropy providing money in different ways into the system. But we have a system where there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines. There are a lot of people out there who actually want to give money into science for lots of different reasons and are just unable to do so. And so there's tons of sideline capital. We saw this during the pandemic because we were trying to coordinate with a number of different funders who had never funded science, but because of the pandemic were very interested. and it was extremely difficult to get money deployed. So there's a lot to sort of work on, and I'll give you an example there. I want to hit a little bit on the sort of like hiding public health behind healthcare issue, and I think one way to think about this is to go look back on the mRNA COVID vaccines. So you can sort of think about vaccines as both a public good and a private good. Private good, meaning, that has some individual benefit for you, reduce mortalities, disease, hospitalization, and then a public good in terms of like reducing transmission. And, you could argue, obviously, and I think we all recognize that it does both. But here's the problem. We actually only tested these vaccines as a private good, right? All of the trial endpoints were on private good. And there was a couple issues in the way we communicated the vaccines early on, where we actually communicated them as public goods. And then when we started seeing breakthrough infections, when people started getting COVID after their vaccination, that sort of breeded this mistrust, or this confusion, at least amongst the public, of like, is this a public good or private good? Further, we actually never optimized these vaccines to be a public good, right? They weren't optimized to actually reduce transmission. There was an implicit assumption based on a lot of historical precedents that there would be some transmission reduction, and there was, but we never optimized to sort of knock out transmission. And there's a lot of, and there's an issue with the vaccines on that front, but then there's also this issue that we left a ton of interventions that were actually more designed to be public goods completely off the table. There's lots of pharmaceuticals that we could have developed that were actually designed to be transmission blocking. They weren't prioritized. We have things like indoor air quality upgrades. Going back to the sort of public health history, we knocked out waterborne diseases in the developed world, not through vaccinations or drugs. We knocked them out because we improved our sanitation, right? So similarly, I think the way to think about respiratory viruses and pathogens is not necessarily to think about vaccines and drugs and diagnostics, but to really improve our infrastructure, right? And indoor air quality is a great example of this that we've pretty much ignored up until now. Another quick example, sorry, I'm trying to see time. Another quick example here is the sort of rapid antigen test. So we introduced rapid antigen tests during the pandemic, and there was this fundamental problem where we actually tried to equate them with PCR tests. The way regulators looked at them, they looked at them as a comparator, and every antigen test was seen as a poor man's version of a PCR test, because they looked at analytical sensitivity as a result. But if you really think about the antigen tests, the lower analytical sensitivity of those tests was actually a feature, not a bug, because it told us something really important. It told us when you were infectious, when you were transmitting virus, because PCR signals would persist, after that period. And so effectively became a public health good. And we tried to think about it from a regulatory perspective, from a communication perspective, but we largely failed. And so this I think, is a failure of the system to not actually prioritize public health products as something to develop and deploy. There's a bunch of, okay. I think I skipped a couple. Anyway, let me go back a second. So what I wanted to hit on the last minute, I think I'm over time, is just something we've been working on to sort of respond to this. And so this is something that's been brewing for the last several months. I've been actually working with Wendy Sue and a few others on this, trying to think about, well, how do we intentionally create solutions at that layer for public health? And I think one of the things that we've been really honing in on is to say that, yes, while policy is very important, and is fundamental, and government funding is fundamental, we really need to think about creating an entirely new set of companies that are attacking these problems in much more durable, effective ways, more directly. And so we're also working on this, sorry, I think I skipped a bunch of slides here. Trying to think about this sort of idea of a venture studio for public health. And can we do three things? Can we combine the right set of capital, where we can actually more patiently deploy capital in companies that are actually deliberately, trying to attack public health problems? Can we actually bring the talent together right? We have this sort of public health community on one side, and then you have a bunch of entrepreneurs on the other side. This is not a community that often comes together, and so we want to deliberately bring, talent that has expertise in both to really think about new types of companies in this space. I want to give you examples because I want to hit on this real quick. So these are 3 companies that we're actually working on right now. One of them is called Catalyze, where we're actually trying to build a two-sided marketplace for R&D funding. Again, one of the issues that I saw during the pandemic was that we were trying to put out all of this money around pandemics, and we were actually hoping to get other funders to kind of pile on and to complement, but we were largely unable to do that effectively. And so we thought, well, what if we build a marketplace where a large set of funders, even those who've never participated in funding science, could actually access high value proposals and opportunities to fund science, and to make it easy for them to make decisions. And so we're working on kind of that thing, that sort of product. A second thing we're working on is with Wendy Sue is an idea called Wild Health Media, which is can we rethink how health information, trusted health information, is actually delivered to people. And instead of thinking about primary care governments as the purveyors of information, can we think about how to integrate this information into more everyday life situations, like going to brick and mortar retail or watching Netflix, right? How do we more effectively deliver this information to actually where Americans are in a way that's sort of trusted? And so we're working on kind of a concept there. The third idea is this idea of how do we get infectious disease surveillance data out there in an effective, durable way, right? The wastewater monitoring system that CDC has started during the pandemic is actually pretty vulnerable right now in many different ways. And absent that, we don't really have a surveillance system in place right now. And so one of the ideas is what if we developed a device that took a diagnostic version of a sensing platform and actually turned it into a device that's a direct-to-consumer, sits in your outgoing household, and actually can detect with anyone in your household is shedding COVID, flu, noro, strep, potentially Hep C. And this would be like an early, like a check engine light for people to detect if anyone's flagging this. This would be an incredibly powerful tool on a household level. If you have multiple school-age kids or an immune-compromised person in your home, this is really useful information to know because it's an immediate alert. It's not a healthcare device because it's not doing a diagnostic function, and so you could actually introduce this direct to consumer. And if you had enough of these around, you would have by far the best infectious disease surveillance data in existence because you would have both geographic and temporal precision in a sort of unprecedented way. So anyway, those are a couple ideas that we have. I'm going to stop here because I think we're way over time, but just wanted to close by saying I think what we're trying to think about with public health is to say, I think we need to think about choosing the right problems. Ones that focus on multiple public health priorities offers kind of a new set of solutions. To really think about, this idea that preventing pandemics is actually pretty much the same as lifting our public health largely. I talked about sepsis, and I'll just mention that 1 in 3 hospital deaths in the US are due to sepsis. And so sepsis is an incredibly important problem for routine care, but also for pandemics. So again, same problem. And that fundamentally, I think one of the issues that we need to solve is business model innovation. I think we need to think more about how we actually sustain new types of companies. And then how do we attract the right set of people into this problem? So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. Okay, big problems to solve. We have time for questions. The vans heading to dinner will be leaving starting at 5:30, but they will circulate. So there are buses. Sorry, I think they're small buses. So we have some time for Dr. Patel about public health, innovation, capital, R&D.
You spoke about public mistrust of science, and in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy, it's quite remarkable that the U.S. Did so much more poorly than similar socioeconomic countries such as Canada, UK, and Australia. Huge statistical difference. How did we screw this up?
I think that'll take longer to outline. I think there's a couple things. I think one is that fundamentally, I think we have to recognize we have a much more complex, diverse culture in the U.S. that made it much more difficult to get behavior change effectively. And so when there was any issue of like asking the public to do something, it's much more difficult to do that in the U.S. So that's sort of one. I think there's obviously fragmented healthcare issues that sort of played out, right? So the UK benefited quite well by having an integrated healthcare system where they actually run trials and understand what's going on in the population. We had a much more difficult time getting the data and doing that kind of stuff. There's a number of other problems, but yeah, that's.
Well, on social media, misinformation, which, we're addicted to our devices here in the United States. We spend our teenagers, 42% of them say that smartphones get in the way of their health. They even know it, right? So we had that huge problem here. I mean, we did everywhere in the world, but we had a bigger problem.
Yeah, and it's also important to mention that we have again, another connection to public health. We have an underlying unhealthy population in the U.S., which made us significantly more vulnerable to the most severe effects of COVID.
Oh, I've done it. Just quickly, Tom, the relationship between academia, the NHS, and government is fundamentally different in the UK than here. You could mobilize people much more effectively in the UK. It's not the case necessarily today, but it was then. My question, I was working in New York actually on sepsis, and then COVID hits. So in the beginning of the pandemic, nobody knows anything about it. Emerging in New York, in Queens, coming out of Newark Airport, spreading out. I was working on renal patients, large renal population, very worried about the dialysis population. So tracked them day to day. The big issue, and a number of things happened which really worried me. Number one is people could not operate outside the box. So the big issue for me that time was, were we going to be quarantined? And if you quarantine, if you look at the renal population who crosses across islands to be treated, what was going to happen to these people? So I ended up hiring a group of people on my own dollar to create a model that reallocated people. But nobody would think about that problem. And the other issue was, you may have to reallocate people across dialysis centers that are owned by other organizations to keep people alive. There was no mechanism to coordinate that whatsoever. And then, of course, once the pandemic died off, and that didn't happen, all of that died. All of the thinking, all the learning around that. So you don't have that as a tool and a methodology for the next pandemic.
100% agree. I actually spent several years on sort of kidney disease and trying to address organ transplant crisis issues. But this is a patient population that just gets routinely underserved, right, in many different ways too. Both because of the way we sort of set up these dialysis clinics, their dependency on like electricity, and there's a lot of.
Right, but nobody thought about the problem.
Yeah.
And in New York, and it was just very upsetting because they would have been hit very hard.
Agreed.
There.
Thank you for this talk. I thought that was really wonderful, and I love the strategies that you're proposing for moving forward and thinking about public health first and how do you get the entrepreneurs in that space. So many of the problems you described feel a little intractable, and I'm just wondering what gives you the most hope in this space? Like, where do you think that the needle actually can be moved in ways that are going to be effective?
Yeah, I think breaking. The sort of strategy around like rethinking, when you sort of like think about a broader set of problems, it's really easy to think about this as like a systems problem that just like doesn't feel like any one person can solve it. We sort of dump it into like, the government should fix it in some ways. I think the way I'm approaching this is to say, I actually think there are entrepreneurial opportunities here. And so one of the things we're sort of going to work on this is to really lay them out in a very specific way to say, like, how can people plug into different pieces of this problem and actually show this roadmap? rather than trying to present it as a giant problem, like break it down into smaller problems. And so, for example, the sort of funding problem, like it doesn't seem obvious to me, most people, that that's like a public health problem, but it really is. Like every situation, everyone's gonna come down to, we need more money, and how do we get more money, right? And so, I think if we're able to make some traction in actually creating a system where it's easy for funders to plug into underfunded areas and things like that, hopefully that's a solution that's like has wide applicability, right? Even though it's a specific solution. And so, yeah, I think it's going to require a lot of people to sort of participate in this. I think the key is to like bring in more people into sort of thinking like this.
I have a question. So I love your talk, except for one slide, which I despised. And I despised it for a narrow reason. And it was early when you showed the development of the vaccine timeline for COVID. And that slide will help the politicians lose sight of the need to do work early. So I think that the real work started 20 years before.
Yes.
And
From the fundamental science.
Every time we show a slide, they will use it that in a way that you should not allow that. You should add the end part and show that you don't have to show all of it, but I wish you would do that, because people are going to listen to you, and we should do nothing to support the idea that we didn't do that vaccine in a year.
Yeah, it was a lot. There were many people involved in this. Agreed. Like it's a story of like everybody kind of like pitching in all sorts of different ways, right?
It's a story of basic science.
Well,
That's the thing, that if we didn't have that basic science, we wouldn't have that vaccine.
yeah, there's so many interesting things. There's the basic science and all of the work that happened at UPenn and lots of other places on that front. There's a story of like the DARPA program that took the mRNA sort of cancer approach and tried to test it for infectious disease for the first time.
There's only one story, and it starts with basic science. Everything you look at starts with funding basic science. You can't separate the end product from basic science. You don't have basic science, you don't have the end product. Simple as that. And that's what the politicians, unless we tell that story, we're in deep trouble.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, here to all you basic
Yeah.
scientists.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's another one.
There's another.
Oh, okay. We'll do there
I can't.
first.
It's hard to.
So, is this on? Yeah. So I ran the convalescent plasma program for the United States. We were asked to start that on March 28th. We administered plasma on April 7th to 100,000 people by September. We had evidence of efficacy by July 1st. It got hung up because of some slow-moving people at the NIH, but ultimately it worked. It got hung up because of the current administration was the prior administration, and nobody wanted another chloroquine. We showed it was safe by May. This was done at scale. We administered the stuff at 2,000 of the 6,000 hospitals in the United States, and the ethnic distribution of the people we treated was far more diverse than the population as a whole. And nobody has asked us about lessons learned. How we did this? How did we get consent forms overnight in 13 languages? We crowdsourced them. All sorts of interesting things like that, and that could be done over and over again. How are we giving as much stuff in Lawton, Oklahoma, as we were at academic medical centers, and getting reports of safety and efficacy? Again, nobody's asked us, and it was quite interesting to see this. But what's more interesting now is just the fact that it's been ignored, and there will be, with the next outbreak, 2 weeks after the first person recovers from disease X, there will be convalescent plasma. If it's characterized and used correctly in high-risk patients, it can be life-saving, and that's been known since 1918. And
Sounds like a good talk for next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
No,
and
it's not-
reinvented with every pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the goldfish thing, right? We keep losing our like lessons every time, and it's like relearned, and So yeah, I'd be curious if you'd sort of documented and shared all of the lessons.
We've documented. We've written 3 things in STAT. We've written a book about
That's great.
it. All kinds of things, and it's just me. with prominent people, members of the National Academy of Medicine, like Arturo Casvidal. Peter Marks was a big supporter. But but I've been struck, especially, we had 2,000 sites. And I mean, if somebody told you in 2019 that we would be doing clinical trials in Lawton, Oklahoma, and Yuma, Arizona, would you have believed them? And getting high quality data.
Sounds like you
Yeah.
need discoverability, and
Yeah.
maybe the Gold Lab Foundation and the symposium can help. We are, yeah. Thank you. So, Dr. Patel, thank you for all of that.
Thanks.
More at the dinner. Conversation to continue. We have one microphone. This is you need to be quick.
I'm going to be quick, I promise.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I think you guys are on to something in terms of the media, in terms of how you present it. Because right now, I have to triangulate the news in order to get a sense of what's really happening. You know, you could say CNN, Drudge Report, Fox, whatever it is, wherever the truth is, it's somewhere in a triangle or a rhomboid or something. And just to have like intelligent people that are non-threatening, that are establishing a sense of commonality with people, and kind of just Joe Fridaying it, like, here are the facts. I think that's brilliant, and I appreciate both of you guys doing that, because I think that's going to make the biggest difference and answer some of the issues that he brought up over there about where did we go wrong, and it's in the messaging of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.